Hi guys, welcome back. In this video we're going to carry on looking at advanced selectors, and here we'll be looking at something called pseudo-class selectors. A CSS pseudo-class is essentially just a special keyword that we can chain onto the end of any kind of selector that will specify a unique state of an element that's triggered by a user. We've seen element, class and ID selectors, child combinators, descendant combinators and sibling selectors in previous videos, and we can chain our pseudo-classes onto the end of any of these types of selectors. For example, a common pseudo-class that we would all be familiar with and use all the time would be the hover pseudo-class, and this generally does what you would expect it to do. Our pages will usually be full of links and buttons for users to click and interact with, and we would ordinarily set some separate styles for these links and buttons that come into play when the user hovers their cursor over the element. This informs the user that the element is interactive and can be clicked. This special hover state triggered by the user that adds new styles are given by the hover pseudo-class. Okay, so I've got a simple sandbox project open here in VS Code, and as always you can find the links to the starting and ending code in the description below. All I've got here is a simple HTML file that contains a couple of linked style sheets. Style.css contains the general styles for this page, and you don't really need to touch these unless you want to mess around with this simple general styling that I've given you. We also have a second file, and this is going to be the one that we will be working in and writing our selectors in, and this is called pseudo.css, and currently I have this in a totally blank state. To get the code, you can go about it in a couple of different ways. You can either download it from this GitHub Repo using this green download button, and then once you have it you just simply open it in your text editor of choice. VS Code in my case. It contains both the starting files, where I'll begin from in this video, and also the files in the state that they're going to be at the video's conclusion. Alternatively, you might not be in a position to be able to download the project if you're working on a public or shared computer, say in a library or at school for example, so you can find the same starting and ending files on CodePen. The only difference between the GitHub files and the project on CodePen is that CodePen only gives us one CSS panel to work in, so any pseudo classes that we add in this video will just go at the bottom underneath the general styles, and I've added comments to indicate where to write each pseudo class that we look at. You don't need to create a CodePen account to work with these projects, and you can start coding as soon as you open the link. It does help if you do have an account, and I would recommend you get one, as CodePen is a really excellent resource. It's free and you can save any pens that you work on to your own profile and then come back to them later on. Okay, so we have this navbar here at the top of the page which contains 3 links to Google, Amazon and Airbnb. Usually, as users of the web, we'd expect something to happen when we hover over a link, a slight UI change to tell us that this bit is able to be interacted with. At the moment, our links aren't doing anything of the sort when we hover them, other than change the cursor, which is probably less than we would want. If we open Google and Amazon in new tabs and then head over to Google, we see that when we hover over these links at the top of the page, they become underlined. At Amazon.com, if we hover over these links at the top, they are given this little border. It doesn't really matter what the styles are, just that something happens. We know that these elements here can be interacted with. It's just intuitive. If we inspect this link here on Amazon, the Today's Deals link, we see in DevTools it is intended as an anchor link. And if we go to the CSS panel, we have this Hov button, which opens a drop-down menu and allows us to toggle various element states. In essence, what this is doing is simulating the adding or removal of a range of pseudo-classes right from the DevTools panel. If we check the MDN page on pseudo-classes now and go down to this bit that says index of standard pseudo-classes, we can see them all there. There's active, focus, focus within, hover, and visited, among others. These are all the different types of pseudo-classes available to us developers, and we'll look at many of these in this video. So back on the Amazon website, if we drag this CSS panel up, we'll toggle on the hover pseudo-class, and you see, if you look again in the CSS panel, that when we do that, it is triggering new styles to be applied to this element from these selectors here, which all have the hover pseudo-class added to the end. Okay, so let's head over now to our text editor and we'll add some pseudo classes of our own to our page, starting with the navbar links. So in the HTML, we have these links with the class of navLink written in BEM notation, and we'll create a selector in the CSS file that selects that, and to make sure that we have the right ones, we'll give them the color of magenta. So we'll save, and that's working, but we want these styles to apply only when we hover the element. So here we're going to add the hover pseudo class, and this is just a colon followed by the name of the particular pseudo class you want to use on the element or the elements that you're targeting. Our styles now return to how they were when we do that, but we see if we hover the links, they are now styling them subject to a hover state. So these pseudo selectors allow us to assign styles to elements via what are in effect phantom classes that are added to elements only when they are in a given state. Like regular classes, you can combine or chain together as many pseudo classes as you want within a single selector. For example, you can make visited links a different color to unvisited links when hovered. So I'll duplicate this selector, and in the top one I'll change the color to yellow for nav links that have been visited, and we'll keep the magenta for those that don't meet this condition, which is obviously any unvisited link. For this we add a link pseudo class which represents an unvisited link, and this one above represents a visited link. Both of these will only come into effect on hover, as we've changed them to the hover pseudo class in each selector. The order that we specify the pseudo class isn't important. They can be written in any order, it doesn't matter. And you can see that now when we hover, we've visited Google and Amazon, but we haven't yet visited Airbnb. We don't have to combine these pseudo classes with the hover pseudo class. We could style visited links differently, which is something that you'll see in a Google search. If you search for something on Google, the results will show pages you've already viewed in a purple color. So I'll duplicate this top selector and move it down underneath the hover pseudo selectors, and we'll make it the color of medium purple. Now when we save, we see our visited links of Amazon and Google are colored differently straight away. So we know that we can use visual styling to determine if a user has visited a given page. Well, 10 or 15 years ago, this led to some security concerns that actually changed CSS. Someone could, in effect, write a script that could go and find all of the links that had styles applied via the visited pseudo class and feed that info back to an interested party. While this might not seem particularly serious for you and I, it can be for web users in countries where one can be jailed or persecuted for visiting a site belonging to, say, an opposition political party or a non-state religious organisation, for example. Thus, 2 steps have been taken to prevent this. The first is that only colour-related properties can now be applied to visited links, so properties like colour or background colour, for example. Attempts to apply any other property to a visited link are now totally ignored by browsers. The second is that if a visited link has its styles queried via the DOM, the resulting value would be as if the link has not been visited. Thus, if you define visited links to be purple rather than an unvisited link's default blue color, even though the link will appear purple on screen to the user, a DOM query of its color will return the blue value and not the purple one. So I just thought that was pretty interesting to share, as something as simple as styling visited links has caused huge security concerns in the past. Okay, so anyway, let's move on. I'm back on MDN, and this time we'll have a look at this root pseudo class. And root selects the root element of our documents, which is, of course, the HTML element. So why use root? We can target the HTML element directly using an element selector, right? So let's select that, and we'll give it a dark background color. Let's say background color of 333 for a really dark grey. And cool, so that works. So now I'll create a pseudo class selector using root, and this time I'll change the background color to a different shade of grey. Let's say all the 7s. Now, When I save, we see the background color change, and this isn't just because the root element is listed lower in the document. We can see that if we just take that root selector and move it up the style sheet above the HTML selector and save again, wherever we put this root pseudo-class selector, it's always going to overrule clashing styles applied by an HTML element selector, and this is because of a concept in CSS called specificity. We can see that on MDN it says the root CSS pseudo-class matches the root element of a tree representing the HTML document. In HTML, root represents the HTML element and is identical to the selector HTML, except that its specificity is higher. We'll look at specificity in the next video or in a couple of videos time at length, but really quickly to clear it up now, it's the idea that when an element has more than one selector trying to apply styles to it, which happens all of the time, some styles are inevitably going to clash, and they can't all be applied to once. You can't have the color red or the color blue applied to the same thing. So CSS needs some kind of rule or law which governs how it decides which of the clashing styles to apply in any given circumstance. So specificity then is a score or rank that determines which styles trump the others and which is ultimately applied to the element. So as a quick example, here we have this nav element which has an ID and a class applied to it. We could select just the semantic nav element and give it the background color of yellow. We could also select the nav class and give it a background color of blue, and we see that when we save, blue wins. We're targeting the same elements here, first using an element selector and second with a class selector. When we save, we see the nav has a blue background rather than a yellow one, as the class is more specific and its styles will win and are applied. We could also use an ID selector to select the element by its ID, and we'll give this the background color of purple. So purple wins. The clashing styles from the class and element selectors are overruled by the ID because an ID has higher specificity. If we inspect the nav elements now, we can actually see that those styles we've been trying to apply to the nav element are all here in the CSS panel in DevTools, but the element and class selectors are crossed out. We can uncheck the ID so it isn't applied and we have blue again. We can uncheck the class selector and we have yellow again. Now we'll bring back the ID and we see that we've now got purple. If I bring back the class, we still have purple. And this is because an ID has a higher specificity than a class, which in turn has higher specificity than an element selector. So in terms of clashing styles, styles applied by an ID selector win over those applied by a class and element selectors. And we'll talk more about specificity, as I say, in an upcoming video, which is probably going to be the next one or the one after. And this is just a quick primer to briefly introduce you to the concept. Okay, so something else that we might want to do is apply some styling to only the first or last child of a particular element, say the first heading on a page or the last link in a navbar, which sometimes we might want to appear differently to the rest. For this, we would use either the first child or last child pseudo-class. So I have this section here which has paragraphs in, and we can select them all by targeting the class on this div and the p elements which are direct children, and we'll make them all magenta. But we want to select only the first p element, not all of them. So if we simply add the first child pseudo-class, we can select that first p or paragraph element. In the same way, we can select the last child. So if we want to select this last paragraph, we use the last child pseudo-selector. So I'll duplicate the selector that we have, I'll change it to last child, and I'll apply a color of, let's say, midnight blue. And we save, and that's it. We can use this to select any child element of a named parent element. Similar to selecting the first and last children of an element, like we've just seen, you can also select the first or last of a particular type of element, which means we can select, say, the first paragraph element inside a div, or the last h2 within a semantic section element, and so on, regardless of whatever elements come before or after. So here inside the HTML element, we have the body and head element, and inside the body, we have a container div, and inside that, we have a nav element and 3 semantic section elements which contain various child elements of their own. We could say that we want to select the first section element inside this container div. So let's select the container first, and we will give that a black border. And when we save, we see very clearly where the container is now. Now we could select all direct children of this container with this selector, which is saying if we read right to left, select all elements that are children. This is the child combinator, children of any element with this container class. I'm going to add a couple of H2 elements at the top, both with the text of hello. This is an H2. And then I'm going to go down to the bottom and I'll add a couple of dead links with the text of link. I'll save the HTML and we have just one element with the container class, and the direct children of the container are nav, these two H2 elements, the three section elements, and our two dead links. When I save the CSS file, all elements are selected, and when I ask for the first child, it's going to give us the very first child element in the container, which when we save is the navbar. When we say last child, that is of course going to be this link. So here's our container and here's our elements within it. The first child is the nav and the last child is this second link. What will happen if we say first of type? Well, we're selecting all elements here in the container and we're asking for the first of type. This selector will go through each element that's a child of the container, find the first time each element occurs and ignore any elements appearing for a second time. So we see that we select the navbar, the only one that we have of course, only the first H2, only the first section element, and only the first of these two links. So it doesn't select everything in the container. We select the first instance of an element when it occurs and skip all of the others. This is a fairly complex selector though, and we could instead simply name an element and ask for the first or last of type. So we'll use a section element selector and select the last of type, and we'll give that the background color of, let's say, medium orchid. And when we save, we see that we have this pinkish colored last occurring section. Also, we could select the last occurring li element that's in the navbar and give it a padding right of 50 pixels. We'll also transform the text to uppercase. So that's something that's really cool, and when pseudo-classes are combined with our basic selectors and our combinators, we're really starting to see how we can burrow down really deeply into our documents and select whichever elements we really want to target with our styles. So we can select elements that are the first, last, or only children of other elements, but how about if we wanted to select every third child, or all odd or even children, perhaps only the seventh child? To do this, CSS gives us the nth-child pseudo-class, which allows us to enter values into the parentheses that represents the numbered position of the child elements that you're targeting. So we have this section which has all of these paragraph elements inside, 8 of them in total, and we can select them all of course by referencing their parent element, which has this class of general, sibling, and we want the p elements that are children of that element. So let's give those a background color of dark violet, and let's start with the first one using this pseudo class. So in effect the nth child equivalent of the first child pseudo class, and this is the nth child with the number 1 in the parentheses. So that's fairly straightforward. So now we know first child and nth child with 1 in the parentheses are interchangeable. If we change that number from 1 to 2, we select the second paragraph element now. If we change that number to 7, then we select the 7th, and so on and so forth. You can insert any number that you choose, and if the element exists, then you'll select it. So it's quite straightforward. If you have a list item that is the 42nd child element of its parent, then you could select that using an nth child pseudo class. If you are mathematically inclined, we can also use simple algebraic expressions inside the parentheses. I will duplicate our selector and change the background color. So for example, if we wanted to select every second child, then inside the parentheses we would use 2n, with n representing every second child. Or we could use 3n to select every third element, or 4n to select every fourth element, and so on. These all start counting from the nth term stated. So 4n would select the fourth item, the 8th item, and so on. Let's suppose that we wanted to select every third item, but starting with the very first item rather than with the third item. We could say select every third item starting the count from 1 by using 3n plus 1. So this would select the first item, the fourth, the seventh, the 10th, and so on. If we said 3n plus 2, we'd select every third element starting with the second. So the second element, the fifth, the 8th, the 11th, and so on. So if I duplicate what we've got here and add a few more properties, I'll say color white, font weight is going to be bold, we'll have text transform uppercase, and we know that the nth child with 2n in the parentheses will select all even numbered children, and we can surmise that nth child 2n plus 1 will select all odd numbered children. Every second element starting with the first, so 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and so on. This is totally fine to do, but we could simplify this and use one of two special keywords that are available to us that nth child accepts, and these are simply even or odd. So for example, if you had a table that contained several rows and you wanted to highlight every other row of the table starting with the first, then you would do it like so. We'd select the table rows, then use the nth child pseudo class to select the odd or even rows, and then give those rows a contrasting background color, like some kind of light grey, for example. We also have some pseudo classes which will style based on the current state of UI elements, like checkboxes, for example. We can enable or disable form input fields using the enabled and disabled pseudo classes. HTML allows us to mark UI elements as being disabled. A disabled element is displayed still to the user, but it cannot be selected or otherwise interacted with. We set an element to be disabled simply by adding a disabled attribute to the element's opening tag. So we have this form here, and we can interact with all of the elements like we would do with any other form. If I go to the HTML file now and find the markup for this name input, I can add a disabled attribute. And when I save that, we can no longer interact with that input. Now we can go to CSS and select any input elements with the attribute present using a pseudo class of disabled. We'll style the placeholder text here using a placeholder pseudo element, which we're going to discuss in the next video, and we'll give that a low opacity, and we'll make the text red, and we will put a line through the text also. Now when we save, we can clearly see where our disabled input is, and we still can't interact with it. Any element that hasn't been disabled is by definition enabled, and you can style these states using the enabled pseudo class. It's much more common to style disabled elements and leave enabled elements alone, but should you want to, you can style enabled elements using the enabled pseudo class. In addition to being enabled or disabled, certain UI elements can be checked or unchecked in HTML. The input types checkbox and radio would fit elements of this type. We have a checked pseudo class to handle elements in that state, though curiously no unchecked. So to target anything that has a checked state, we could say checked, then our curly braces, and then we will have some box shadow. And we see now that when we cycle through the radio inputs and the checkbox, that when they are in the checked state, they have this awful box shadow applied to them now. The pseudo class required matches any form control that is required as denoted by the presence of the required attribute in HTML. You can see that we have the required keyword on the name and email fields of the form, and the presence of this keyword means that the form cannot be submitted until these fields have been filled in with valid information. So we'll use the required keyword in our CSS to target the placeholder pseudo element again and make the text uppercase. Okay, cool. So let's look at the last pseudo class that we're going to cover, and this is the negation or the not pseudo class, and we're going to talk about what that is and what it can do for us. This is a really interesting pseudo class actually. In rather than selecting elements, we're saying to not select given elements. So in the example given on the MDN website, we apply styles to anything that is not a paragraph, so it excludes the selector that you place between the parentheses. Now, some browsers allow us to add more than one selector here, but MDN warns us that it is still fairly experimental and that should be avoided where possible. So let's see it in action, and we'll move away from our file for this, which is getting pretty busy and cluttered, and we'll pop over to CodePen to look at a simple example of the not pseudo class in action. As always, the link is below in the description, and here we just have a simple bit of HTML with some basic styles, and we're going to use the not or negation pseudo selector to select any anchor tag that is not red. You see we have our first anchor element that has the class of red chained to it, and the red selector that is doing what you would expect and simply applying a red color. Now I'm going to select anything on the page that does not have that red class and give it the color of magenta. We now see that when we save, that the second anchor tag, the logo text, and the text in the two divs is magenta due to the rule that we've just applied. The first red anchor tag is totally unaffected. We can confine this to the anchor tags by adding an A in front of the not pseudo class. Personally, I find this technique really useful when you want to target everything but the last child or the first child when adding padding or margins to whole sections. So what I'll do is I'll add an unordered list in the second div, and I will give that 6 list items, and I'll give it the text of list item and then the corresponding number. And I'm going to target everything now except for the last item in the list using the not pseudo selector. So we'll say UL, LI, and not the last child, and we'll give those the color of orange. Now each item we see is orange except for the last one, and we can also use this to target everything but the first child. So I'll duplicate that, I'll change from last child to first child, and this time we'll give that the color of blue. We can also use nth-child to target everything that isn't every child divisible by 2. I'll duplicate this again one more time, and this time we'll change the color to red, and what we'll do now is inside the parentheses of the not pseudo class we'll use the nth child to target everything that is not every child divisible by 2. So it will target children 1, 3 and 5. One caveat is that in a real-world project we probably wouldn't use the not pseudo selector to simply apply colors, though it can be used for that if need be. We can use it for when we're applying margins or paddings. So say we have a 4x4 grid of images we are applying margin right to, so we can space one image from the one that follows. We could refrain from applying margin right to the 4th, 8th, 12th and 16th images, which could throw the grid off center. Or if we had several content sections on the page, we might want to give them margin bottom to space them nicely, except for the very last section on the page, which has nothing below it and therefore doesn't need the same spacing applied below it. Okay, so we'll stop here. If you found this video useful, then please remember to smash the like button, subscribe, share, and all of that good stuff, as it really helps with YouTube's algorithm and makes the channel much more discoverable for people that could really benefit from the content. Also, reach out to us on social media or in the comments below if you have any questions or feedback, or even if you just want to say hi. Links to all of the resources used in this video are in the description below, as always, and if there's any other useful resources that you know of, please add them in the comments section below, and I can add them to the description if they're relevant to the video. So thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate your time. Join me in the very next video, in which we're going to be talking about pseudo elements. We've seen one in this video, the placeholder, and pseudo element selectors are those which allow us to select a specific part of a selected element, like the placeholder of an input field or the first line or letter of an element. So watch out for that video in the next few days. And thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.